How is it possible to spend 80 hours a week learning Chinese? And what can you learn from that, even if you're busy juggling work, family, and other commitments? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about how to learn more Chinese without studying more or without investing more time. This sounds like a cheap sales trick, but it's not. There are many ways you can diversify your learning away from traditional studying methods that will allow you to learn a lot of Chinese without actually scheduling more study time. This is very important, no matter if you're studying full-time or if you're busy with work, family, and other commitments and are studying Chinese on the side when you have time. Indeed, I would say that the busier you are with other things, the more you will benefit from the advice I'm going to offer and discuss in this episode. However, the principles we're going to discuss are equally applicable for those who study full-time and who are fully committed to learning Mandarin as quickly as possible. In the introduction, I mentioned spending 80 hours a week learning Chinese, and to most people this sounds completely crazy, but this is a volume I maintained for long periods when I studied full-time. But like I said, it isn't as crazy as it seems, and the principles are applicable no matter how much you are studying. The first thing I want to discuss is what I mean when I say learning Chinese, and this is deliberately the most broad term that includes anything that helps you improve in Mandarin. This is different from studying Chinese, at least the way we use the words in everyday language. Studying seems to imply that it's somehow more serious, maybe. You sit down with a textbook, you look up grammar patterns you don't understand, you learn characters, or maybe you study the subtitles of a movie you watched recently. And this studying is usually done in longer chunks of time. So if I were to say that I studied Chinese for 80 hours a week and this is what I had in mind, that would indeed be crazy. I don't think it's possible to keep this up, and I don't think it would be healthy or even helpful to do so. But that's not what I said. I said learning, and that includes all sorts of things that people generally don't think of as studying. I will discuss more examples later in this episode, but just to show you a few examples, I'm talking about things such as writing difficult characters on your hands. That way you will see them occasionally throughout the day, and this probably doesn't meet most people's standards for studying, but it can still be helpful for remembering these characters. You could also bring out your flashcard app when you're waiting for a friend or when you're queuing in the supermarket and things like that. It could even be something further removed from traditional studying, such as listening to your favorite Chinese songs in the background while working. Now, clearly, the examples I've brought up here are not superior to scheduling an hour of studying Chinese, but the point is that they don't compete for the same kind of time, and so you can do both, and you should. I've written about spending more time learning Chinese from several angles before on Hacking Chinese, and this is probably the most important factor for how much you learn, because it doesn't really matter how great your method is or if you're learning the most relevant content if you're not investing enough time. So here I will introduce 3 concepts that I think are helpful, and they all have articles and/or podcast episodes, and I'll put links to those in the show notes. The first one is time quality, so this is about studying the right thing at the right time. So every unit of time throughout a day has a certain quality, where higher quality means you can do more things with it, and lower quality means you can do less things. Let's look at 2 examples. So first, if you are in an important meeting, this will be very low time quality seen from the perspective of learning Mandarin, because you can't study or do anything else while you're in this meeting, assuming that it isn't in Chinese and it's with your tutor, of course. But let's say it's at work and your job has nothing to do with Mandarin. Compare this with a Sunday afternoon when you have nothing planned and you could basically do anything. You also have access to all the resources you want, so you could literally study anything you want. Naturally, most of the time we have is not of perfect time quality, and it's not of zero quality either, so it's on a spectrum, which means there is a certain amount of room to learn Chinese while doing other things. The key insight here is that you need to use your high quality time to perform learning activities or studying, which requires high quality, and then you use the lower quality of time to get everything else done. For example, you shouldn't spend 40 minutes before going to bed doing all your flashcards, because this is an activity that could have been spread out throughout the day in much smaller pockets of time of less quality. And what you're doing if you're doing all these reviews in a 40-minute period before going to bed is that you're wasting the higher time quality of those 40 minutes. You could have used that for something else which couldn't been broken up like that. Maybe reading something longer and more interesting in Chinese, or listening to something interesting that requires a lot of focus, or otherwise studying something that requires time of higher quality. Another example might be to use high quality time with a tutor to learn the basic definitions of words, because these you could have, of course, learned on your own, and it would have been almost the same as with a tutor. So you waste the high quality time with a tutor since you didn't use the lower quality time you had on your own to prepare. The second concept I want to talk about is the time barrel, which is essentially a way of looking at a day where you use different kinds of rocks, sand, etc. to fill up all the available time. And this includes things you have to do, so work, family commitments, etc., but also, of course, learning Mandarin. The time barrel is meant to highlight the fact that you do have more time learning Chinese than you think. But to see this, you need to zoom in, you need to break things down into smaller chunks. You can't think of half an hour of studying or an hour of studying. You need to think in minutes and overlapping ideas, as we saw with time quality. The third way to learn more Mandarin without actually studying more is the forking path. It's not very managerial, you don't deal with goals and you don't track your progress, etc. It's just about all those micro choices we have every day and about making more choices that lead to more Chinese. In essence, this is about heading in a certain direction, including more Chinese, not about setting a specific goal and making sure you end up there. So an example might be when you pick up your phone, you have a choice. What are you going to listen to? Are you going to listen to the podcast in your native language, or are you going to choose a Chinese language podcast? And the more often you choose the Chinese alternative when you have choices like this, the more Chinese your days will include and you will be able to learn a lot more. And this builds up over time to make a significant difference. Naturally, this is not only about choosing podcasts, it's about every choice we make every day. So now I think we're ready to talk about the title of this episode, which is Diversify How You Study Chinese to Learn More. So the key here is diversifying. We cannot think of studying as a monolithic activity we schedule in half-hour chunks. We need to break it down into much smaller components than that and look at every single activity that could help us improve. Some of these will be small enough that they can fit into slots throughout your day, which means they won't really impact anything else you're doing, but you will still learn more. Other learning activities are a bit porous, so they can be overlaid or overlap with other activities, such as listening when you're doing other things you need to do in a day. So the way I was able to learn Chinese for 80 hours a week was, of course, that I was first studying full-time. So maybe I did spend 8 to 10 hours actually studying Chinese in the traditional sense. I had many lessons, I prepared for those lessons, I reviewed, previewed, etc. I also lived in an immersion environment, so I spoke Mandarin with people around me daily, which didn't feel like studying, but which was still something that I did. In addition to all of this, though, I learned to use all the small pockets of time that I had. I made sure that I studied all my flashcards throughout the day, maybe while waiting for the bus or in an elevator or wherever else I happened to have a few minutes. I fished out my phone, reviewed some flashcards and put it back. And if you do this 20 or 50 times throughout the day, you don't need to spend 40 minutes at the end of the day to review flashcards to stay on top of your flashcard game. I also listened a lot to people around me, but also to recorded podcasts, etc., whenever I was doing something where I could listen at the same time. And this is something you can learn, even if you right now think it's tricky to focus on something you're listening to, while also, say, cooking. This is a skill you can practice and a capacity you can build up. So that's how it's possible to log more than 80 hours of learning in a week, but it's also how it's possible to learn Mandarin while being busy with other things. And like I said earlier, I think these principles are even more important if you're not studying full-time. If you have a full-time job, you have a family, and you struggle to find time to learn Mandarin, even though you want to, then making sure that you use all these pockets of time and these porous activities that can overlap with other things you're doing is extremely important, because that's how you get most of the hours. That's how you listen more, read more, get more flashcards done, etc. Before we wrap up this episode, I'm going to do as I promised earlier and give more examples of diversified learning. The first one is listen to recorded material. And this is something I've already mentioned, but since it is the most powerful way to learn Mandarin when you're busy, I want to mention it again. For many people, it's possible to listen to Chinese for 12 hours a week without really impacting many other things you're doing. And you can listen even more than this if you ramp up your listening over time. There are several articles and episodes on hacking Chinese discussing how to do this in practice, and I also have a course, Fluent Listener, that you can check out at hackingchinese.com/courses, so I will link to all these things in the show notes rather than making this episode longer than it needs to be. Number 2 is spaced repetition software, or SRS for short. These are apps or computer programs that allow you to keep track of and remember a large number of words and characters, and if you make sure to follow the advice I gave earlier to spread your reviews out throughout the day, you can learn and remember a lot of vocabulary in Chinese without impacting many other things you're doing. One of the major advantages of flashcards is that they can be reviewed in very small pockets of time. It's usually, for example, not a good idea to read for 2 minutes. Most people think that this is frustrating and not very rewarding, but you can certainly review flashcards for 2 minutes. Next up is one of my favorite tricks, which is to write difficult characters on your hands. These are usually gone within a day or two, but you get to see them a lot since they are on your hands and you tend to see your hands quite often throughout the day. Naturally, you have fairly limited writing space on your hands, so reserve this for characters that just refuse to stick. Maybe it can be part of your leech hunting routine. And I'll put a link in the show notes to an episode about leeches and how to deal with them. Naturally, this is not limited to writing characters on your hands. Say that there are a few characters that you keep mixing up. Maybe it's time to sit down and study them properly. And this is something you use traditional study time for. But you then produce a good comparison with example sentences and maybe something that highlights the difference between the characters you keep mixing up. And then you put this summary somewhere where you will see it automatically, maybe above the sink or in the bathroom somewhere. This means that over the coming days and weeks, you will have time to review what you wrote and learn the difference between these characters and stop mixing them up. Next up, I want to highlight the importance of smartphones as a tool for learning Mandarin. And this is not necessarily a specific activity that you do, but it's more that there are so many activities you can do with a phone that you would need dedicated resources and time to do otherwise. A good example might be listening that we've already mentioned, but it could also be reading. If you're limited to reading physical books, you have to lug them around with you in order to be able to read anything at all. But if you have a novel or a graded reader or some other text on your phone, you can just read there when you have some time to spare. Digital reading has huge benefits for Chinese learners, and this is something I've discussed elsewhere, and as usual, I'll put links in the show notes. While we're on the topic of smartphones and digital devices, you can change the interface language to Chinese. This is an old trick that works pretty well, at least if you're already an intermediate or advanced student. Essentially, it means you will go about your day, do your things, work, etc., but you'll get exposed to a lot of extra Chinese on the way, essentially for free. Of course, there's a certain cost when you start doing this, because it will be hard in the beginning, before you learn how the interface works and before you learn the most common words. It's probably a good idea to make sure you have time to actively study the interface and learn things, because otherwise this can be rather daunting, especially if you're a lower intermediate or even upper intermediate student. It's also worth mentioning that many digital dictionaries have features that allow you to look up characters on screen, so even outside the app, and Pleco is a good example of this. My final example of diversified learning is taking notes in Chinese. And this could be any kind of notes. It could be what you're supposed to buy next time you go to the store. It could be notes from a lecture if you're a student, or it could just be thoughts about what to plant in your garden. But anything you write down for other purposes than learning Chinese, see if you can write some of that in Chinese, because then you'll get two things done at once, and you will not only be able to do what you wanted to do, you will also learn Chinese along the way. So these were just some examples of why diversified learning is smart learning. You can learn a lot of Chinese without scheduling long chunks of study time, and even if you're busy with other things. It does take time to build up the habit of thinking of your time in the ways that I've described and finding these pockets of time or opportunities to learn Mandarin. So my suggestion is to do it gradually, look for a few opportunities, see how you can use them, and then you build from there. If you want more advice for how to do this in practice, I think listening is the best area to start in, because I already have a lot of articles and episodes about how to listen more and how to combine it with other activities, etc. And as mentioned earlier, I also have the course, The Fluent Listener, that has a whole section about this. And as mentioned, these principles are applicable to other areas, not just listening. So good luck with diversifying how you learn Chinese. It will allow you to make progress and learn more without necessarily taking much time away from other things you find important. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.